And for this last session, we are delighted to welcome Professor Thomas Coomans, who is an undisputed authority in this field. Professor Coomans teaches the history of architecture and conservation of the built heritage at Louvain. For 30 years, he's been doing research, and his publications focus on Catholic sacred architecture and study on medieval monasteries, and on the other, on reuse and repurposing of churches, with some specific aspects in Eastern Asia. He's also the founder of an organization which I think many of us know about, the Future for Religious Heritage, FRH, which has undertaken many initiatives and tries to achieve networking among all those concerned with the reuse of church heritage. He's a member of ICOMOS, to do with religious rituals. It's a part of ICOMOS. So I too have been able to look at and know a book that he's the author of, connected with our subject today.
Yeah, but they are hearing you.
Yeah. Life inside the cloister. So we're delighted to have him. We welcome him and look forward to hearing his words.
Thank you, Luigi, for your long and warm presentation. I thank the organizers of this important conference and their invitation to share some reflections about recent trends in the field of living heritage. Living heritage is defined as cultural heritage, tangible or intangible, which is still in use for its original purpose, with continuous strong bonds to a core community. Abbeys, monasteries, convents, and other religious houses have been built by and for core communities, in harmony with their specific monastic tradition. Accordingly, the secularization of religious houses means a break in the continuity of religious tradition, an irreversible loss of living heritage. The main question of this lecture is it possible to perpetuate the spirit or intangible heritage of life inside the monastery after the departure of a religious community? In other words, what are the conditions to keep the spirit of the place after the community left the place? Reuse of existing buildings and sites for other purposes than their initial use is an age-old practice. It's not new. However, adaptive reuse of historic buildings with the awareness of their heritage values and the cultural significance of the place is relatively recent. It has been theorized in several international documents issued by ICOMOS, such as the 1964 Venice Charter and more recently the 2013 Bura Charter. Bura is a place in Australia. The 2018, that is even more recent, Leeuwarden Declaration promoted the multiple benefits of reusing of built heritage, smart and quality-based processes, and a dialogue between heritage and contemporary architecture. Today, adaptive reuse deals with all kinds of building types and is evolving according to criteria including culture, economy, sustainability, social and community life, education, environment, and so on. This lecture is organized in 3 parts. First, the secularization of religious houses before the modern age of heritage and its consequences on the heritage of these places. Second, the concept of living heritage in general and living religious heritage in particular. Third, the challenge of keeping alive something of the tradition and values of the past communities of consecrated life through understanding and keeping alive the spirit of the place. The reuse of abbeys, monasteries and convents for purposes other than those for which they were designed is not a new phenomenon. In the countries that became Protestant in the 16th century, suppressed monasteries, friaries and convents were often demolished and the land subdivided, in particular in urban settings. While in rural contexts, the farms and the mills of the monastic domains were taken over by private owner and monastic buildings became ruins. Monasteries have always been coveted for their real estate value in particular. In many cases, only a name of a street reminds their presence. In the 1790s, the French Revolution caused a new wave of suppression of all the religious communities and massive secularization of their properties and the destruction that ensued. In Bruges, for example, the 11 male and 22 female religious houses were all suppressed. Soon after, most disappeared from the landscape. Such large-scale real estate redistribution was an extraordinary opportunity for the modernization of cities, but a terrible loss of heritage. In the 19th century, concordates regulated the relationship between the state, the diocesan structures, and the parishes, but did not include institutes of consecrated life. Anti-clerical governments regularly lashed out at religious institutes, and secularization, accompanied with new wave of expulsions, seizures, and sales, occurred in Portugal, in Spain, in Switzerland, in Western Prussia, and in France, not forgetting communism in Russia after 1917 and Central Europe from 1945 to 1989. Many of the suppressed religious houses owe their salvation to sustainable new uses. The majority of Catholic hospitals and educational establishments retained their use, but were secularized. For others, the morphology of the buildings around the cloister favored certain types of functional adaptive reuse that required enclosed courtyards. Cloisters, gardens, and domestic farms were spatial assets that only religious houses could offer. In my book, Life Inside the Cloister, I have proposed a typology of other uses, from farm to factory, manors, and other residential houses, to barracks, arsenals, prisons, and courthouses, museums, and libraries, etc. Some reuses were motivated only by pragmatic considerations, devoid of any material heritage dimension. Most of the furbishing was vandalized and sold. Once emptied, buildings could be transformed and churches divided in multiple floors. While other buildings were demolished, the materials recycled and the grounds redeveloped. Abbey sites located in valleys with a river and water mills became ideal sites for early Industrial Revolution factories. In some cases, the state saved archives and books, selected works of art, and moved them to new created public museums, libraries and archives. This was an early form of public heritageization, of movable heritage. But it was also a form of secularization. In museums, religious works of art have been decontextualized and have lost their original intention of devotional media. Comparing the Rubens paintings in the Brussels Museum, which all were created as altar pieces of monastic churches, with the Rubens of the Baroque altar in the Jesuit Church of Antwerp, shows how an abstract context adds to the loss of significance. In the museum, the paintings are masterpieces whose aesthetic quality exalts the genius of the painter, but have lost their primary destination and therefore are no longer constitute living heritage. The artworks, but are no more living heritage. From the early 19th century, reused monasteries gradually gained a heritage dimension. Such heritageization process develops precisely when the object has lost its value and is threatened. The best example is the ruin, which, by definition, is an abandoned building without use. Centuries after their destruction, such ruins, having attracted Romantic artists who raised heritage awareness and nostalgia, in the same way as ruins of Greek or Roman or Egyptian temples. These stone remains have conditioned the Western approach of architectural heritage. This is very important. In the 19th century, which for a long time was exclusively material-based. Such sites are not living heritage, but they retain high aesthetic and historic values, but they are disconnected from their core communities and people. In the same way as the decontextualization of religious works of art contributed to their secularization, many repurposed abbeys became national monuments and were at the very heart of national conservation policies. The abbeys of Mont-Saint-Michel and Fontevraud in France, two icons of medieval monastic architecture, served as prisons for a long time. This use guaranteed the basic maintenance at a time when barely any thought was given to heritage. Their subsequent heritageization gradually led to their protection, their restoration, their conversion, and finally, their inclusion on the World Heritage List. Clairvaux, the Abbey of Saint Bernard, has not yet reached this stage of heritageization. Part 2. Gradually developing from the 1960s, the drying up of religious vocations has resulted today in a considerable loss of interest in institutes of consecrated life. Since the 1970s, thousands of urban and religious houses have been sold, demolished, reused, and repurposed across Europe and North America, beginning with small diocesan religious institute of women and congregations of brothers, but deeply impacting today all the international religious orders. The situation is not the same everywhere. The Netherlands, Quebec, Belgium, France are leading this general trend, but most other Western countries see their communities aging. In the field of heritage, an important shift occurred in the 1990s, with the growing interest for intangible cultural heritage promoted by non-Western cultures. So that's a shift from the Western approach of heritage based on materiality, of stone ruins, to a more inclusive approach of heritage coming from non-Western culture. In 1994, the Nara document on authenticity, Nara is a place in Japan, issued by ICOMOS, included intangible heritage and cultural diversity. Today, this approach, based on people and the involvement of communities across all categories of material and immaterial heritage, has become central to the field of cultural heritage, including religious heritage. The UNESCO 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage defines intangible cultural heritage as, I quote, the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, and skills, as well as the instruments, the objects, the artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith, that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This intangible heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, interaction with nature and history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. In the same year, 2003, that is 19 years ago, the international ICROM, the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, based here in Rome, organized a specific forum on the conservation of living religious heritage. That's really our topic. In the introduction of the proceedings, Herbst-Stovel defines 6 issues in reconciliating faith and conservation, dealing with conservation of living religious heritage. First, changing liturgical and functional needs. 2, the competing requirements of coexisting faith, different religions. 3, fluctuating interest in religion. 4, growing secular pressures on places of religious value. 5, the museification of religious places and or objects. 6, conservation intervention, continuity of faith versus scientific conservation. This is all about living heritage. The conclusions written by Herbst-Stovel include 6 points that deserve to be reminded. The first, we know since 2 days that living religious heritage is of particular importance, given its vital role in conveying, expressing, and sustaining the faith which give spiritual meaning and purpose to human life. The second is understanding living religious heritage requires that the tangible and intangible cannot be separated, since all cultural material has an intangible value. 3, living religious heritage is at risk in a number of ways. 4, the care of this heritage is primarily the responsibility of the religious community for whom this heritage has importance, but in collaboration with conservation professionals. 5, the adaptation of religious practice, rituals or festivals to contemporary circumstances should be understood as a normal part of the continuity of living religious heritage and should be respected. 6, respect for religious values in a multicultural context is essential for promoting peace and a tolerant society. It is best promoted through strengthening interfaith dialogue on conservation issues. Here must be clearly reminded that living religious heritage should not be confused with the theological dimension of faith and religion. For UNESCO, living heritage only concerns liturgical practice and rituals, festivals, and pilgrimages, but not the content of the faith, because that should be the same for all religions worldwide. Here we come to a core concept, that of continuity. This reflection has been developed by Gamini Wijesurya from Sri Lanka, and he has written a crucial reflection of living heritage and his knowledge on Buddhist communities. He defines continuity of use as the main criteria of living heritage. He defines continuity of use from the permanent interaction, and you see the arrows, permanent interaction of the community, of the continuity of community, the continuity of expressions, and the continuity of care. And there is no hierarchy. It is an interaction, a continuous interaction. That means that when a break in continuity is happening, then there is a discontinuity. And consequently, there is a loss of living heritage. This doesn't mean that heritage dies, but it is decontextualized and is no more living heritage. Other values, as aesthetic values and historical values, remain. Think of the Rubens painting in the museum. However, it might have acquired a new function and in some cases could even become living heritage related to new core communities. In the context of the Charisma et Creativita conference, I must briefly mention a book published by Ioannis Poulios in 2014 on the Orthodox monasteries of the Meteora in Greece. The past in the present, a living heritage approach. This is the first in-depth study about living cultural heritage in a group of monasteries which are still populated by monks, but also attract pilgrims and tourists. Moreover, the Meteora are inscribed in the World Heritage List since 1988. A very complex situation. And so I reached my third part, from living heritage to the spirit of the place. Without being synonymous, the notion of tradition and heritage values share common points in the terms of transmission. It is clear that the cultural heritage of the institutes of consecrated life is part of their charisma, of their specific family traditions. We can also say that the traditions of the institutes of consecrated life are part of the universal legacy of Christianity, but also of Western civilization and heritage. Is it possible to perpetuate the spirit or intangible heritage of life inside the religious house after the departure of its core community. In other words, what are the conditions to keep that spirit of the place after the community left the place? That was my main question. Due to the lack of vocation in a changing society, most communities are currently experiencing profound crisis. The challenge now seems to be one of tangible, intangible, and even spiritual monastic memory. Of what, why, to whom, and how to pass this on. The magnitude of heritage awareness we are witnessing reveals the gravity of the situation, as work to remember begins precisely at the moment when meaning is lost. I would like to begin this third part with the notion of tradition, which comes from tradere, to transmit. The monastic tradition in particular, or rather the handing down from generation to generation of the essence of monasticism itself, or other forms of religious community life. Each community of consecrated life has its own tradition or charisma. They are nearly synonymous, to my understanding. Religious traditions are rooted in places and also include the memory of people, both holy people and otherwise. The challenge of communities is to keep their tradition alive while adapting to the reality of society and the church. By doing so, they continue this tradition and ensure that it will be passed on. The concepts of tradition and heritage share some common grounds. In this discussion of architecture of religious houses, heritage means the transmitted cultural goods in their immovable and tangible forms, as well as their interaction with movable, tangible goods and intangible forms. Even a graveyard of an abbey belongs to the living heritage of a community. The link between religious tradition and monastic architecture is undoubtedly the spirit of the place, which has been defined by Laurier-Turgeon, a Canadian researcher, as being between tangible and intangible heritage. Pierre Lucier, another Canadian researcher, reflections on spiritual tradition and the spirit of the place perfectly expresses the key point on adaptive reuse of monastic heritage. I quote, "Between the spirituality of religious families, the architectural design of their religious houses and buildings, and the means of their presence and action, there are correspondences that count for much in the spirit of the place contained in these complexes. It is this spirit of the place that constitutes the foundation of the cultural significance of religious houses, that if their authentic heritage value is recognized, they can provide guidelines for profane reuse likely to respect and prolong their symbolic potential." The closure of a monastery or a convent is usually accompanied by a loss of living heritage, a discontinuity in the tradition of the religious family, but no discontinuity in its material or built heritage. When a monastery is closed and its church deconsecrated, the key question is whether this gesture of closing is enough to efface the complexity of the meanings embodied in the monastery at different scales and levels, transforming it in a simple container in which any new use can be installed. At this very precise moment, the specific challenge facing religious heritage arises. How can the shift from the sacredness of religion to the sacredness of heritage and culture be made successfully? Is such a transfer possible without losing the spirit of the place? It is there that education in religious heritage intervenes, with its religious, secular, tangible, and intangible concerns. What should the response be to a genuine demand from heritage tourists or religious pilgrims? Monastic sites, whether living heritage or secularized heritage, religious or profane, ruined or filled with art treasures, continue to attract many visitors whose motivations are varied. Many are in search of point of references, silence, a slower pace, and even spiritually in one form or another. These needs seem to belong to a society exculturated of Catholicism, as have been analyzed by sociologists like Liliane Voyer and Daniel Hervieux-Léger, who spoke yesterday. This could be illustrated with recent forms of socio-cultural reuse that aim at conserving immovable and movable cultural heritage, as well as the spirit of the place. Amongst several recent experiences, I would like to end this lecture with two examples that are very recent, so we don't know if they are sustainable in long term, but two recent examples. One is a former male abbey in a rural context, and the other is a former female monastery in a historic city center. The village of Francis opened in October 2020 in the former Trappist abbey of Sainte-Marie-du-Désert near Toulouse. According to the website, the mission is, I quote, "The village of François develops and animates innovative shared living spaces that bring together vulnerable people and their companions around three axes: living together, economic activity, and integral ecology. We want to network," still the quote, "we want to network different solidarity actors by offering them a global and ecological vision of housing and work. We want to contribute to the emergence of a fairer and more human society by developing innovative lifestyles that allow authentic living together, imbued with benevolence." The Augustine Monastery of Quebec is a heaven of heritage, culture, and wellness. It is located in the historic wings of the Hôtel Dieu of Quebec Monastery, from which emerged the very first hospital on the American continent north of Mexico.
Thomas, sorry, 3 minutes. Okay.
Le Monastère is a non-profit organization with a charitable use. We are committed to offering our visitors of all cultures and spiritual horizons a unique experience of journeying toward wellness. It is an adventure in itself and an invitation to visitors to live to their own journey. Plenty of sociocultural other uses are possible if heritage awareness and knowledge of the specific tradition of the place, its spirit, are combined. However, the concern for authenticity remains an essential condition to the safeguarding of the spirit of the place. Seeing fake monks promote fake monastic products is not part of the spirit of the place and in no way of living heritage. Conclusion. Monastic architectural ensembles organized around cloisters, often in remarkable locations, have particular potential when it comes to adaptive reuse. Explicit heritage ambitions are therefore essential to the success of any project. The only way to understand their complex cultural and historical significance is to contextualize the buildings from a holistic perspective that includes every aspect of architectural and historical study, as well as spiritual and intangible dimensions. We discussed the concept of living heritage and understood that any religious house that loses its core community will lose its dimension of living heritage. We also understood that the main challenge is the current phase of transition, which is more advanced in some countries than others, is to keep the spirit of the place and to find the appropriate sociocultural reuse that would be in accordance with the religious tradition of the past community of consecrated life. Therefore, whenever possible, it is recommended to involve the last members of the community in the process of discussing the adaptive reuse project of their monastery. I experienced cases like that. We also recommend a particular attention to the most vulnerable architectural complexes, which are not the big historical abbeys and the landscapes that are already heritagized. I'm thinking in particular of the religious houses which are not designated historic monuments. The architecture of recent past, which does not arouse great interest because it remains unknown. The diocesan congregations, which are not comparable to the powerful networks of international orders. And the innumerate convents of nuns, a large number of which have already been sold to developers and demolished. All things considered, the destiny of these buildings is very similar to what happened during the secularization waves of the previous centuries, as we've seen in the beginning of this paper. Unlike movable heritage, libraries and archives, which can be transferred or preserved by appropriate institutions, buildings are connected to their site and always have a real estate value. Two other fundamental values should be systematically taken into consideration. On the one hand, the local society in which the religious house is rooted and which will survive the departure of the religious. And on the other hand, the religious tradition of charism of each community which can continue to live in one way or another in the spirit of the place. These are the very conditions that could lead to the continuity of an adapted but still living heritage. Thank you.